The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon when Jenna Monroe eased her aging Subaru Outback into a spot just across from her new townhouse. Her husband Rick hopped out first, stretching after a long drive from San Diego. They had just completed their move into the Willow Ridge community, a suburban neighborhood that promised quiet streets, manicured lawns, and a strong sense of safety. The promise was what sold them. "Finally here," Jenna said, smiling, her voice thick with fatigue and hope. "Yeah," Rick nodded, grabbing a box from the back seat. "Doesn't look too bad. Could be nice." They didn't notice the small red and white sign tucked against the curb that read, "Guest parking only. 2-hour limit. No overnight parking." Jenna's Subaru would be there until the morning. It was a simple mistake. Honest. They'd moved in late, had nowhere else to put the car for the night, and weren't fully unpacked enough to notice the HOA welcome packet buried in one of the boxes, the one that contained all the rules. By 7 a.m. the next morning, the car was gone. Jenna stood in her pajamas, barefoot on the dewy sidewalk, staring at the empty spot with wide, sleep-ridden eyes. "Rick, it's gone." Rick stumbled outside, toothbrush still in his mouth. "What?" "Gone. The car. My car. I parked it right here." He looked around, then ran his hands through his hair. "Towed?" They called the HOA office first. The woman who answered, someone who introduced herself only as Marla, sounded amused. "You parked overnight in a guest space," she said flatly. "We have a strict policy. Violations are towed immediately. It's all in the rules you agreed to." Jenna tried to explain. "We just moved in yesterday. We didn't even— No exceptions. The board takes enforcement very seriously. You'll need to pay the impound fees and file a correction form. It's all in the packet." Rick's expression hardened. "Okay, fine. Where's the impound yard?" Marla chuckled faintly. "You'll have to contact Ridgemont Towing. They work with us exclusively." It took hours, a $380 impound fee, and a 45-minute drive across the city to get the car back. But something about the interaction rubbed Rick the wrong way. "I don't like this place," he muttered as they drove home. "Something's off." Jenna didn't disagree. And over the next few days, the feeling grew stronger. They began to notice strange things. Subtle at first. Notes taped to their front door with vague messages. "Remember the rules." Trash cans repositioned slightly off their driveway, just enough to technically break regulation. And the real kicker, a formal warning letter for excessive use of holiday lighting when Jenna had only strung up a single string of white bulbs around their balcony. Rick decided to confront the HOA head-on. He attended the next meeting in the clubhouse, expecting maybe a dozen residents gathered in fold-out chairs. What he found was something more cult-like. There were only 5 people in the room, seated behind a long oak table like judges presiding over a trial. At the center was an older woman with sharp eyes and a permanent frown. She introduced herself as Margaret Delacroix, president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. "You're the new tenants at 212 Birch Lane?" she asked, her tone already accusatory. "We own 212 Birch Lane," Rick corrected. "We didn't rent. We bought the property, and I'd like to know why we're being harassed over a simple parking mistake." Margaret steepled her fingers. "We do not consider it harassment. We enforce order. One small infraction left unchecked creates cracks in the entire foundation. That's how chaos begins." Rick stared, taken aback by the intensity. "We weren't warned. We had no notice. You didn't even knock on the door. You just had the car towed." "That's the policy," she replied coolly. "And if you can't follow rules, Willow Ridge may not be the right place for you." Rick left the meeting fuming, but he didn't say another word to Jenna until they were back inside their home. "You were right," she said quietly, already reading his face. "There's something wrong here." They thought they could lay low and avoid trouble, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Later that night, as Rick stepped out to bring in the trash bin, he noticed something wedged between the lid and the handle. A photo. It was a picture of their Subaru, parked, at night, from an angle that suggested it was taken by someone standing just outside their window. No note, no message, just the photo. Rick turned slowly, scanning the darkened street. The street lamps flickered above, and in the distance, a pair of headlights turned off, as if someone had been watching and decided it was time to disappear. Jenna locked the doors. Rick closed the blinds, and Willow Ridge didn't feel like home anymore. The next morning, Rick installed a security camera over the garage. He wasn't sure if it would make a difference, but he needed something, anything, to push back against the creeping paranoia that had taken root. Jenna backed him up, though her nerves were fraying. She had trouble sleeping. The quiet hum of the HOA-controlled neighborhood now felt like a smothering silence, but what truly rattled them came the next night. The camera caught someone. At 2:13 a.m., a shadow crept up their driveway. The figure stayed just out of reach of the motion detection lights, wearing what looked like a black hoodie and gloves. It paused by Rick's car, crouched near the tires, and appeared to inspect something. After about 20 seconds, it slipped back into the night. Rick reviewed the footage frame by frame in the morning, gripping his coffee cup so tight his knuckles turned white. "Why didn't they slash the tires?" Jenna asked. "Why just look?" "I don't know, but they knew exactly where the camera's blind spot was." That day, Rick filed a report with the police, but when officers showed up to take a statement, one of them raised an eyebrow when he heard the address. "Willow Ridge, huh?" the officer muttered, scribbling something in his notebook. "That HOA's been flagged before. You should be careful." Rick leaned in. "Flagged for what?" The cop shook his head. "Can't get into it, but if you've got somewhere else to stay, even for a while, might not be a bad idea." Jenna overheard it from the kitchen. She grabbed Rick's arm the second the cops left. "We're not going anywhere. This is our house." Rick nodded, but he could see it in her eyes. She was afraid. So was he, but neither of them liked being pushed. So Rick did what he did best. He investigated. He dug into public records, HOA bylaws, court filings, anything he could find online. What he discovered was unsettling. Over the last 5 years, at least 7 families had sold their homes in Willow Ridge after moving in for less than a year. Most had left under strange circumstances, citations, fines, liens on their homes over minor violations, even forced compliance fees. A few had tried to sue the HOA, but the cases were always settled quietly and sealed. It wasn't enforcement, it was expulsion. The board didn't just maintain order, they punished defiance. And Margaret Delacroix had been president for all of it. Rick dug deeper into Margaret. There was surprisingly little. No social media, no news articles, no LinkedIn profile. Just a mention in a real estate journal from 2002, noting her purchase of 4 units in the neighborhood during a down market. Jenna was pacing behind him when she finally said, "This isn't just about a parking spot anymore, is it?" No, Rick answered. I think they wanted to provoke us. I think they test new owners. See who'll fall in line. Or who they can push out. Then came the letter. Unlike the others, printed, impersonal, cold. This one was handwritten and delivered directly into their mailbox. You were warned. Next time, you won't see us coming. That night, Jenna stayed awake, clutching a flashlight. Rick held a baseball bat under his side of the bed. But nothing happened. Not yet. The next morning, HOA violation number 4 arrived. Unapproved door color. Rick stared at the slip, baffled. We haven't even painted the door. But the notice claimed it was off-shade, compared to approved tones in the community standard. They were being fined $75 per day until corrected. Jenna snapped, "This is war. This isn't about compliance. This is personal." Rick agreed. It's time to go public. He reached out to a local real estate blog anonymously. The reporter, a young woman named Kayla Simmons, replied within the hour. "You're not the first," she wrote. "I've been chasing whispers about Willow Ridge for over a year. People are afraid to talk, but if you've got proof, I'll listen." He showed her the photos, the letters, the camera footage. Kayla asked for time to investigate on her own. Meanwhile, things at home escalated. More fines, more notes. Someone keyed the side of Jenna's car. The trash bins disappeared, only to reappear a week later, filled with rotting meat. Their Amazon packages were stolen. The HOA claimed no responsibility. And then came the neighborhood meeting flyer. It was left in every mailbox but theirs. Rick found out from a neighbor who whispered it to him while checking the mail. They're calling it a community discipline forum. The neighbor glanced around nervously. They're talking about you two. That night, Rick parked 2 blocks away, walked back, and watched through the clubhouse windows. Inside, he saw the 5 board members gathered around the long table, Margaret at the center. There were printed images taped to the whiteboard behind them. One of the images was the same photo they'd found, the one of Jenna's car at night. Another was a still from their security camera footage. A third was a satellite image of their backyard with a red X drawn over the shed. The entire room radiated control, obsession. When Rick came back inside the house, his hands were trembling. "They're watching us," he said to Jenna. "They've been watching everything." Jenna looked pale. "Rick, what do we do?" He answered without hesitation. "We dig deeper. We fight. And we find out what the hell they're hiding." By the time Kayla Simmons arrived on their doorstep, Rick and Jenna were running on nerves and coffee. Kayla, in her late 20s with a no-nonsense attitude and a voice recorder clipped to her jacket, looked like someone who didn't spook easy. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've got something," she said, stepping inside. "It's not just about the rules. It's about money. Big money." She set down her bag and pulled out a slim black binder. "I pulled financial records from the county registry. The HOA's been funneling money through a maintenance contractor that doesn't exist. Vantage Property Solutions. That's who invoices for sidewalk repairs, light pole replacements, landscaping, all of it. But when I checked the address," she flipped to a page with a photo of an empty lot surrounded by a chain-link fence. "It's a shell company. And guess who's on the board of directors? Margaret Delacroix's son, under a different last name. Jason Rell." Rick's jaw clenched. "They've been pocketing HOA dues." "For years," Kayla said, "and they target homeowners who push back. You rack up violations and they use those to justify liens. Some people just give up and sell. Guess who buys the homes dirt cheap then flips them? Jenna stared, stunned. Margaret? Kayla nodded grimly. Her and a few others on the board. It's a racket. And the worst part? They've got lawyers. Deep ones. They're protected. It all made sense. The obsessive control. The hidden cameras. The intimidation tactics. It was never about rule enforcement. It was about control and profit. Rick's eyes burned. We've got to expose them. I'm already working on the piece, Kayla said, but I need more. Harder proof. Whistleblower testimony, financial documents, internal communications. That's when Jenna spoke up. They keep all the HOA files in the clubhouse basement. Rick saw them in the window. If we can get inside… Kayla hesitated. That's risky. You could get arrested. I don't care, Jenna said. They already think they own us. It's time we show them we're not afraid. That weekend, under the cover of a neighborhood yard sale, Rick and Kayla snuck into the clubhouse using a maintenance key stolen from the shed behind the HOA office. The basement was exactly what they expected. And worse. Dozens of boxes stacked neatly, all labeled. Violations, hearings, payments, enforcements, confidential. Kayla set up her camera and started snapping photos. Rick opened a box marked confidential correspondence, legal, and pulled out a file labeled Delacroix Doctrine. It wasn't a legal document, it was a manifesto. Handwritten notes from Margaret outlining her principles for community purity, including phrases like, exert subtle control early. Shame breeds obedience. Nonconformity is contagion. Financial pressure corrects behavior. Jenna's voice crackled over the walkie. Someone's coming. Get out. Now. They grabbed what they could and slipped out a side door just as a black SUV rolled up to the clubhouse. Margaret got out. She looked toward the building, paused, and then slowly scanned the area. Her expression wasn't angry. It was amused. That night, someone broke into Rick and Jenna's garage. Nothing was taken, but everything was moved, just enough to let them know someone had been there. The next morning, Kayla's car had its windows smashed. Inside, a single note taped to the steering wheel read, "Some stories aren't yours to tell." Rick convened a quiet meeting with a few neighbors they trusted, people who had whispered support in passing but had never dared stand up. Among them was Marcus, a retired Marine who'd lived there 6 years. He nodded grimly when they told him everything. We always knew something was off. Now we know what. He pulled out his phone and showed them pictures from 2 years ago. This was my wife's car. They towed it without warning and fined us for abandoned property. She was sick, couldn't drive it for weeks. The stress made her worse. We moved her to her sister's after that. Jenna's voice cracked. You never filed a complaint? Marcus looked at her. They fined me for a grill. A grill, Jenna. They don't just enforce rules. They break people. That's when the idea was born. The coalition. They'd gather every homeowner willing to speak out, compare fines, gather photos, videos, records. And when Kayla's piece went live, they'd follow it up with a neighborhood-wide lawsuit. A class action. But they had to move fast. Margaret wasn't waiting anymore. 2 days later, Rick received a certified letter. It wasn't a violation. It was a notice of liens. The HOA had assessed over $8,000 in fees for non-compliance and property disruption and was threatening to seize the home if not paid within 30 days. They're trying to force us out, Rick muttered, his voice like gravel. Jenna put her hand on his. Then let's give them a war they'll never forget. Kayla's article went live on a Thursday morning. The title hit like a brick: HOA, or organized extortion. Inside the shocking scheme, draining a suburban neighborhood. Within hours it had gone viral. Local news picked it up by noon. By evening, a regional station was running a segment featuring blurred interviews with homeowners, Rick, Jenna, Marcus, and two others, voices altered and faces shadowed. The reaction in the neighborhood was immediate. Some homeowners were furious, not at the HOA, but at Rick and Jenna for dragging the neighborhood's name through the mud. "They're tanking our property values," one man shouted during a makeshift HOA meeting in the community clubhouse. But others, more than expected, whispered support in driveways, knocked on doors with trembling hands, and passed copies of their own violation records to Rick and Jenna's mailbox. By Sunday, the coalition had grown from 4 to over 20 homes. Margaret didn't wait long to strike. On Monday morning, Rick opened the front door to find a notice stapled to their tree. Notice of suspension of membership rights, claiming they were barred from using any community facilities, including the pool, clubhouse, and shared paths. That afternoon, they received a cease and desist letter from the HOA's attorney accusing them of defamation, property trespassing, unauthorized surveillance, and inciting civil unrest. And then came the unthinkable. On a rainy Wednesday evening, as Jenna finished up a call with Kayla, a loud pop echoed outside. A flash of orange light pulsed against the curtains. "Rick!" she screamed. They rushed out to find Marcus's truck parked across the street, engulfed in flames. Someone had set it on fire. Sirens followed minutes later. The fire was put out quickly, but the damage was done. A police report was filed. The fire marshal called it arson, but there were no cameras, no witnesses, and no suspects. Later that night, Marcus spoke with quiet intensity. "I don't scare easy, but this was a message." Kayla nodded. "And now I have my headline for part 2. But it wasn't just about the HOA anymore. It was about fear. Real fear. Neighbors were suddenly hesitant to speak. Anonymous threats began showing up in mailboxes. The coalition meetings had to be held secretly, in basements and backyards after dark. Jenna found a small tracking device duct-taped inside their rear bumper. Kayla's editor pulled her off the story after someone from a legal team representing community interests threatened a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for invasion of privacy and incitement of harassment. The HOA had money, and they were using it to silence everyone. But Rick wasn't done. If they wanted silence, he'd give them the opposite. He called a press conference right on his front lawn. By this time, the story had gone national. HOA horror stories were trending on social media. Public interest lawyers, watchdog groups, even a congressional candidate began weighing in. With the media present, Rick stood beside Jenna, his arm around her shoulders. "This isn't about one bad board or one corrupt HOA. This is about unchecked power. About what happens when we let people with control use it to intimidate, manipulate, and destroy. We are not backing down." Behind them, dozens of neighbors held signs. "Stop HOA abuse. We are not violations, we are people. Enough is enough." The next day, 3 members of the HOA board resigned. Margaret did not. Instead, she filed a motion for a temporary restraining order against Rick, Jenna, and Kayla, claiming harassment, intimidation, and threats of bodily harm. It was laughable, until the judge granted it. They were now legally barred from coming within 100 feet of Margaret Delacroix, including at any public HOA meetings or at the community clubhouse, which she had now locked to everyone for security reasons. But Rick and Jenna weren't giving up. They met with an attorney named Elliot Brandt, a heavy hitter who'd taken down a corrupt police union 5 years prior. He read through their documents, saw Kayla's footage, scanned the financial records, and smirked. "They screwed up," he said. "You have them on fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, racketeering, and intimidation. If you're ready for war, I'll bring the tanks." Elliot Brandt didn't waste time. By the end of the week, he had filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of 31 homeowners, naming the HOA, its individual board members, including Margaret Delacroix, and their legal firm as defendants. The charges were no joke: civil racketeering, RICO embezzlement of HOA funds, fraudulent enforcement of violations, retaliation and intimidation of residents, abuse of authority and breach of fiduciary duty. The lawsuit detailed not only the financial irregularities uncovered by Jenna and Rick, but also the violent threats, manipulated bylaws, and misuse of fines and dues. Elliot made sure the press had copies. That Friday, a CNN anchor closed their segment with, "In a suburban nightmare that reads more like a political thriller, a local HOA now faces federal scrutiny after a massive class action lawsuit exposed a web of corruption and fear in what was supposed to be a peaceful community." Margaret responded the only way she knew how, with escalation. First came the smear campaign. A website popped up overnight, HOAFActsNow.com. It accused Rick and Jenna of fraud, claimed Elliot had been disbarred, he hadn't, and even uploaded blurry photos suggesting they were secretly profiting from the chaos with links to a fake GoFundMe page. The site was traced back to a shell company, one registered under Margaret's son's name. The next morning, flyers with the same accusations were duct-taped to every mailbox in the neighborhood. But this time, no one bought it. Marcus knocked on Rick's door. "You're winning, man. She's cracking." More neighbors began speaking openly. A few brave ones stood up at the next board meeting and demanded an immediate vote to dissolve the current leadership. Margaret canceled the meeting. She blamed unprecedented hostility and safety concerns. Then came the tech purge. Margaret ordered the HOA servers cleaned for security, but she didn't realize 2 coalition members worked in IT. One of them, Tara Patel, had quietly cloned the HOA's drives 2 weeks prior. She now delivered a thumb drive to Elliot. On it were internal emails, deleted violation logs, secret memos on how to pressure troublesome owners, and even an email from Margaret admitting she forged a neighbor's signature on a lien filing. Elliot grinned like a wolf. "She's toast." He handed the files to the state attorney general. As the legal walls closed in, Margaret made one last desperate move. She tried to transfer the HOA's remaining $248,000 in funds to a private consulting firm based in Nevada, a company run by her nephew. The bank flagged the transfer. The account was frozen. Then the IRS showed up, and just like that, Margaret disappeared. She didn't show up to the next hearing. Her house was empty. Her phone went to voicemail. No one had seen her since the day the lawsuit became public. Her lawyer resigned from her case. The HOA board crumbled. One by one, the remaining members resigned. Some moved out of the neighborhood. Others cooperated with investigators, admitting Margaret ran things like a personal fiefdom, and they were either afraid or complicit. The court appointed a receiver, a neutral third party, to take over HOA operations until the investigation was complete. The coalition, now formalized into an independent homeowners committee, began working with the receiver to rebuild trust and transparency. Jenna took the lead on setting up monthly open meetings. Rick helped design a website where all violations, fees, and votes would be publicly logged. No more backdoor dealings. The community slowly, cautiously began healing. But the real victory came 2 months later. Rick got a letter in the mail. State of redacted Attorney General's office. It announced that criminal charges had been filed against Margaret Delacroix, including wire fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. A nationwide warrant was issued. She had become a fugitive, and just like that, the monster who had turned parking violations into weapons and power into poison was no longer in control. The community was never the same after the storm, but maybe that was a good thing. For the first time in years, people waved to each other without suspicion. Parents let their kids ride bikes without worrying about HOA safety citations. The oppressive silence that once gripped the neighborhood had lifted. There was laughter again, cookouts again, life again. Jenna stood on the front porch one sunny afternoon, holding a glass of iced tea. Rick was fiddling with a new motion-activated camera he'd mounted on their garage. Not for paranoia, but for peace of mind. They'd learned their lesson. "Feels almost too quiet," Jenna said with a little grin. Rick looked over his shoulder. "I'm okay with quiet now. The right kind." The lawsuits were still moving through court. Elliot told them it could take a year or more to fully unravel the financial damage Margaret had caused. But homeowners were already seeing refunds. Fines were reversed. Liens canceled. Some were even pursuing separate civil suits. Kayla, the journalist, returned to the neighborhood one last time. Not for an expose, but for a celebratory interview. The headline this time was, "From HOA Hell to Neighborhood Heroism, How One Couple Sparked a Movement." She filmed Rick and Jenna on their front steps. Behind them, the coalition waved from the lawn. "Would you do it all again?" she asked. Rick glanced at Jenna. "In a heartbeat," he said. "People need to know. When something feels wrong, it usually is. And if nobody stands up, nothing ever changes." But the past has a way of knocking one last time. It was 2 weeks later. Rick found a manila envelope tucked under their doormat. No name, no address. Inside, a single flash drive. Jenna and Rick plugged it in with hesitation. A grainy video began to play. Security camera footage from the HOA clubhouse months ago. A dark, windowless room. A group of people seated in a circle. Margaret at the center. She was speaking calmly, coolly. "And if any of them push too hard, we isolate them. Fines, suspension, legal pressure. Most people cave. The ones who don't, we'll make examples of them." Someone off camera chuckled. Another voice asked, "And if that doesn't work?" Margaret, "Then we go after what they love." The screen went black. Jenna's hands trembled slightly. Rick stared at the paused screen. She wasn't just petty. She was dangerous. They sent the footage to Elliot. It was added to the case. A new angle of investigation opened. Criminal conspiracy. Possible civil rights violations. Federal interest grew. Weeks later, federal agents finally caught up with Margaret in a lakeside cabin 3 states over. She had dyed her hair, forged documents, and drained an offshore account. She was arrested without incident. At her first court appearance, she didn't speak, but her eyes, cold, calculating, found the camera lenses in the courtroom and held their gaze. As if to say, "This isn't over." Rick and Jenna didn't attend the hearing. They didn't need to. They had already won. Epilogue. The coalition lives. On months passed. The new HOA, now truly democratic, thrived. Board positions were voted on publicly. Budgets were open books. Violations had actual grace periods and community discussion before enforcement. Jenna was asked to run for board president. She declined. "I'd rather be the watchdog," she smiled. "No offense." Rick chuckled. "None taken." But together, they did help start a statewide advocacy group, Homeowners Against Abuse. It grew fast. They helped other neighborhoods stand up. They testified in front of the state legislature. New laws were drafted, ones that would prevent the kind of horror they had lived through. They even helped a family across town who had been fined $1,200 for parking their RV during a storm fight back and win. And every time Rick passed the spot where his car had once been ticketed for unauthorized parking, he smiled. Because what started as a petty fight over a yellow sticker had become something bigger. A revolution. A reminder that sometimes the smallest injustice hides the darkest secret, and that standing up, even just once, can change everything.